August 21, 1942. The jungle of Guadalcanal held its breath, thick with the sour scent of rot and the restless hum of insects. Damp vines clung to tree trunks, the canopy above leaking spears of silver light through leaves heavy with rain. Beneath that green cathedral, men crouched, waiting. Some whispered prayers in English, others in Japanese. Both sides believed the next few hours would decide not only survival, but the future of this campaign. And in the hands of one group of men rested a rifle many still considered untested, even laughable, the American M1 Garand. The Japanese infantry, veterans of brutal campaigns across China and the Pacific, had reason to be confident. They carried the Arisaka, a bolt-action rifle tested by decades of empire-building wars. It was simple, sturdy, and precise. They trusted its slow rhythm the way a swordsman trusts the feel of his blade. To them, the Garand seemed clumsy, almost comical, an overeager machine that spat bullets too quickly, betraying its user with that strange metallic ping when its clip emptied. Some joked it was a child's toy, unsuited to the discipline of real war. Tonight, they intended to prove it. Their plan was simple: overwhelm the Americans in a sudden nighttime assault, shatter their fragile line, and throw them back into the sea. On the other side of the Tenru River, the Marines dug in. Foxholes pocked the sandy bank, rifles balanced across muddy berms. The men were young, many no older than 20. They were not yet the hardened veterans they would one day become. Sweat streaked through dirt on their cheeks, their uniforms stiff with salt. Some shifted uneasily, haunted by the growls of the jungle. Malaria buzzed in the air as much as bullets might soon. Yet their rifles, those heavy Garands slung across tired shoulders, gave them an edge they barely understood. Each man held in his hands the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle the world had seen, a weapon designed not for elegance but for relentless, unyielding fire. The jungle pressed close, its silence deceptive. Every snapping twig might be a monitor lizard, or it might be a column of soldiers moving through the undergrowth. The Marines gripped their Garands tighter, feeling the oil-slicked wood against their palms. The weapon was heavier than the Springfield bolt-action rifles their fathers had carried in the last war, but it offered something unprecedented: speed. 8 rounds fed into its clip, fired as quickly as a man could pull the trigger, no need to pause and work a bolt. It was a gift of time measured in fractions of seconds, fractions that could mean the difference between living and dying in a night assault. Historical records tell us that Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki led the Japanese force that night, about 900 men strong. They believed the Americans before them were weak, exhausted, and easily broken. Ichiki had already dismissed American firepower as inferior, describing the Marines as poorly trained, poorly armed, and ripe for destruction. It was a confidence born of earlier victories in Asia, where Japanese infantry had charged headlong into battle and won. What he did not yet grasp was how technology had shifted the balance. Inside the foxholes, Marines whispered to each other. One 19-year-old from Kentucky muttered that the jungle smelled like a swamp back home, only worse. His buddy, a tall farm boy from Minnesota, patted the Garand's wooden stock and said, half joking, "She'll talk loud enough tonight to scare the devil himself." Such fragments of conversation capture the heartbeat of men about to meet history. They were scared, yes, but they held on to humor because humor was the thinnest shield against fear. Hours passed. The sky above thickened with clouds, swallowing moonlight. Around midnight, the first sounds rose. Faint shouts in Japanese, a whistle, the rhythmic tramp of boots in mud. The Marines froze, eyes straining into darkness. Then came the burst. Rifle fire, wild and high, followed by the crash of mortars. The jungle erupted. The Japanese surged forward, their bayonets glinting as they charged across the river's shallows. For them, it was supposed to be a swift and glorious attack. For the Marines, it was the test they had dreaded. And then the Garand spoke. 8 rounds cracked from one rifle, then another, until the night became a storm of thunder. The .30-06 Springfield rounds, heavy and fast, tore through undergrowth and bodies alike. Each Marine pulled his trigger again and again, the semi-automatic action slamming forward, spitting brass into the mud. The enemy had expected the slower rhythm of bolt-action fire. Instead, they met a wall of bullets, ceaseless, unrelenting. A Japanese soldier would fall before he could even chamber a second round of his Arisaka. The sound of the metallic ping, that supposed weakness, rang across foxholes. Far from being a signal for easy attack, it was drowned in a symphony of overlapping fire. By the time one Marine reloaded, 2 others were still firing, their rifles barking in deadly rhythm. The Japanese discovered that speed mattered more than ceremony, and that courage alone could not stop lead moving at 2,800 feet per second. In official accounts, it was said that the tenor ran red by morning. Nearly 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying. Marines counted 34 of their own loss. The numbers alone tell the scale of imbalance. Yet the story was more than statistic. Veterans recalled the smell of gunpowder mixing with jungle decay, the flashes of light painting ghostly faces in the dark, the screams that carried across the river and were swallowed by the trees. One Marine wrote later, "We fired until the barrels smoked, until our hands blistered. They kept coming, but it was like mowing wheat in August, they just went down." For the Japanese survivors, shock set in. Diaries recovered later spoke of disbelief. They shoot without pause, like many machine guns, but every man has one. It was not supposed to be this way. The rifle, mocked as noisy and clumsy, had rewritten the rules of close combat in the Pacific. And it did so in a single night, on the banks of a river few Americans had even heard of before 1942. As dawn crept over the jungle, pale light revealed the carnage. Steam rose from muddy ground where rifles had burned hot through the night. Marines staggered among shell craters, their faces hollow, their ears still ringing. They were exhausted, but alive, and many quietly understood that their survival hinged on the weight of wood and steel they had carried with them ashore. The Garand had not just worked, it had saved them. Yet in that silence after battle, as helmets lay scattered and bodies floated in the Tenaru, a realization cut through the haze. This was only the first test. The Japanese army had been bloodied, not broken. Reinforcements were already on the way, and the jungle would soon echo with more shouts, more gunfire, more death. The Garand had proven itself, but whether it could hold back wave after wave of determined assault, that question remained unanswered. And so, with the mist lifting and the river flowing quietly as if nothing had happened, the Marines reloaded their rifles, adjusted their helmets, and braced themselves. For though the laughter had ended that night, the war in the jungle was far from finished, and what came next would test them in ways no one yet dared to imagine. The sun had barely lifted itself above Guadalcanal's ridges when the Marines surveyed the ground they had held through the night. The Tenaru River flowed quietly, a mirror of light broken only by drifting debris. On the far bank, the jungle was littered with broken shapes, helmets, rifles, bodies. A few men rubbed their swollen eyes, their hands still trembling from hours of shooting. Others sat silently, staring into the trees as if the shadows might leap alive again. They had survived, yes, but survival did not mean peace. The Japanese were not finished. The jungle whispered that more was coming. In Washington and Tokyo alike, the Tenaru would be noted as a battle, but for the men here it was more than a line in a report. It was the first proof that their strange semi-automatic rifle had done more than pull its weight. It had tipped the scale of war. And yet, even in the grim calm of morning, some Marines smiled faintly at a small irony. The enemy had mocked the Garand, sneering at its supposed clumsiness, but those same men had been cut down by its relentless fire. The ping, that metallic chime when the clip sprang free, had not betrayed them. It had been drowned in a chorus of shots so fast and so constant that no charge could break through. The conflict now was not merely physical but psychological. American troops, many of them green when they landed on August 7th, carried themselves differently after tenor. They had seen what their weapon could do. Private Jack Hodge, who had fired until his shoulder throbbed purple, wrote to his mother, "It's heavy, Mom, heavier than I like. But I'll carry her anywhere. She spits fire like the 4th of July." In contrast, captured Japanese notes spoke of disbelief. They shoot always, never stopping. It is not like men with rifles but like many machine guns together. It was as if both sides had witnessed not just a fight, but a revelation about what modern war would demand. The Garand's advantage was mechanical but decisive. Where the Arisaka forced a soldier to pause, lift, and work the bolt, the Garand flowed with the rhythm of the trigger finger. 8 rounds, heavy with .30-06 punch, left the barrel in seconds. The difference could not be measured only in numbers. It was measured in the way attackers faltered when their comrades fell in sheets, before even reaching the wire. Historian John George, who fought in the Pacific, later observed that the Garand was the equalizer of night assaults. In the jungle, where lines blurred and distances vanished, speed became survival. By September, more clashes confirmed the lesson. At the Battle of Bloody Ridge, Japanese forces launched wave after wave of night attacks against entrenched Marines. Each time, the Garands unleashed their rapid fire, cutting through the screaming charges before bayonets could find flesh. Marines spoke of the surreal quality of it, thousands of men charging uphill into a wall of firepower. Sergeant John Basilone, who would later become a legend, manned his machine gun alongside riflemen whose Garands never let the line falter. One survivor of the assault recalled, "It sounded like every tree was spitting fire. I've never heard rifles so loud, so many so close." The ridge held, and the myth of unstoppable banzai charges began to wither. Still, the Marines knew their enemies were not coward. They were ferocious, disciplined, and willing to die. What unsettled them was that the Americans, often dismissed as soft, had met that ferocity with a new kind of relentlessness, the relentlessness of technology married to grit. Humor emerged in the ranks as a coping mechanism. Some joked that the ping of the Garand was the sweetest bell in the Pacific, a dinner bell for death. Others teased that the rifle could wake the dead, and if it did, the dead would just fall again. Dark laughter drifted through foxholes at night, laughter that hid fatigue and grief. Yet in quieter moments, reflection seeped in. Corporal David Martinez, a schoolteacher before the war, admitted to his diary that he felt conflicted. "I hate the killing. I hate watching them drop. But if it's us or them, this rifle makes sure it's them. And maybe that means I get to go home." The Garand had become more than steel. It was a lifeline. The soldiers' bond with it grew intimate, almost superstitious. Some gave their rifles names. Others stroked the stock like a talisman before battle. The Japanese, too, adapted. They tried flanking maneuvers, creeping through jungle trails to outwit American fire. But even then, the Garand's rate of fire chewed through ambushes. At times, Japanese troops believed they were under machine gun attack, only to discover later it was simply riflemen working their triggers. War diaries from Japanese officers carried back to Tokyo noted, "Enemy rifles outnumber us in speed. Our bravery cannot close distance." The tone was not mocking now, but weary, almost resigned. By late 1942, Guadalcanal had become a furnace, not just of battle but of morale. Hunger gnawed at both sides. Disease took more lives than bullet. Yet in this crucible, one truth hardened. The Americans had a weapon that kept them alive when the odds should have killed them. The Garand's .30-06 rounds shattered not only ambushes but illusions. And illusions mattered as much as numbers. Soldiers fight with more than muscle, they fight with belief. When the Japanese charged, they believed their ferocity would carry them through. When the Americans fired, they began to believe the Garand would not let them down. A Japanese prisoner later confessed to his interrogators, "Your rifles never stop. We fear them more than your artillery." That statement, stripped of pride, captured a shift deeper than tactic. A weapon once mocked as unproven had become an instrument of dread. The battlefield had turned into a classroom, and the lesson written in blood was that speed and firepower would rule the wars of the future. For the Marines, the sound of the Garand became synonymous with survival. The blast of its barrel, the hiss of rounds cutting through foliage, even the metallic ping as a clip flew free, these were the sounds of staying alive. Veterans would never forget it. Decades later, at reunions, old men with gray hair and shaky hands would still mimic that ping with a smile, as if hearing an old comrade's voice. But beneath the memories of fire and steel lay another truth. The Japanese were not finished. Reinforcements poured onto Guadalcanal. The Tenerife and Bloody Ridge were victories, yes, but they were preludes to greater storms. The jungle had not yet revealed all its teeth. What the Garand had proven in sudden night assaults would soon be tested in drawn-out campaigns, where endurance mattered as much as speed. The men who gripped those rifles knew it, even as they wiped sweat from their brows and whispered jokes in the dark. And so the Marines cleaned their Garands, reloaded their clips, and braced for the next assault. They had discovered a weapon that could shatter ambushes and break charges, but whether it could carry them through months of hunger, mud, and ceaseless attack, that was the question that hung over Guadalcanal like the mist. For in the jungle, victory was never final, and the echo of the Garand's ping would soon meet challenges even more brutal than those first nights by the river. September brought rain to Guadalcanal. Sheets of water poured from the sky, pounding the earth until foxholes filled and trails turned to rivers of mud. Malaria swarmed in every stagnant pool. Men shivered in damp uniforms, their boots rotting on their feet. And yet, amid this misery, the battle lines hardened. The Japanese army poured reinforcements into the island, determined to retake Henderson Field and erase the Americans from the map. Each side believed the coming weeks would decide the campaign. It was not merely a contest for land. It was a struggle of faith in weapons, in tactics, in the very idea of superiority. For months before Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers had believed in their invincibility. They had crushed opponents across Asia, from Manchuria to Malaya. The world had watched their empire expand at lightning speed, fed by discipline, ferocity, and the belief that courage could outmatch material. In their doctrine, the bayonet charge was still king, the Arisaka rifle steady in hand, the warrior spirit blazing. The Americans, they thought, were soft, spoiled by comfort, hesitant in combat. On the muddy slopes of Guadalcanal, those myths began to unravel. The Battle of Bloody Ridge in mid-September was the breaking point. There, Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki's failure at Tenerife was echoed in another desperate assault. This time it was General Kawaguchi's force, over 3,000 men, marching through jungle shadows to strike at the heart of the Marine perimeter. They believed the ridge would fall in a single night. Instead, it became a slaughter. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers hurled themselves forward under cover of rain and darkness. Their shouts pierced the night, bayonets glinting, grenades hissing. And each time, the Americans responded with a wall of fire. The Garands barked relentlessly, their muzzles flashing like lightning across the ridge. One Marine survivor described it years later. It was like mowing wheat. They came in lines, and each time they fell the same way, as if a scythe cut them down. The statistics are stark. Nearly 3,000 Japanese killed or wounded against fewer than 100 Marines. But numbers alone cannot capture the feeling of that night, the ground trembling under boots, the stench of cordite and blood, the sight of charging silhouettes collapsing mid-stride under the relentless crack of the Garand. The rifle, once ridiculed, had become the centerpiece of survival. Each metallic ping of an empty clip was followed instantly by another Marine's volley, creating a deadly chorus that broke every charge. The Japanese soldiers fought bravely, but bravery could not overcome velocity. Their Arisaka rifles, precise but slow, left them at a disadvantage they could not close. Every time they paused to cycle a bolt, another .30-06 round ripped through the foliage. Survivors later confessed in captured diaries that they felt as if they were charging machine guns, not individual rifles. One note read, "The enemy rifles fire without end. Our courage cannot reach them." It was not merely defeat, it was disillusionment. In Tokyo, reports grew grimmer. Commanders spoke of American firepower with a new tone, one tinged with caution. "Their rifles shoot as if endless," one report stated. Japanese propaganda tried to conceal the scale of losses, but the men at the front knew the truth. They had encountered something new, something that made their old tactics suicidal. The myth of their superiority was cracking under the weight of reality. For the Marines, the transformation was equally profound. They had arrived on Guadalcanal with uncertainty gnawing at their nerve. Now, after Bloody Ridge, their confidence had deepened. They were still hungry, still sick, still outnumbered, but they had faith in the steel they carried. A private from Ohio wrote to his family, when the rifle kicks, I feel like I'm not alone. She fights with me." In those words lies the intimacy soldiers developed with their weapons. The Garand was not just a tool, it was a companion, an extension of their will to live. Humor, as always, helped dull the edge of horror. Marines joked that the Garand was a Jap stopper, a phrase muttered between drags of cigarettes in muddy foxholes. Others teased that if the Japanese really liked charging, the Garand would gladly welcome them. The laughter was rough, even cruel, but it kept despair at bay. In the thick rain and buzzing insects, laughter mattered as much as bullet. The myth of Japanese superiority also collapsed in another sense. Logistic. The Americans, despite hardship, still received supplies. Rifle clips, ammunition, food when possible. The Japanese starved, their supply lines shredded by U.S. Navy control of the seas. Hungry men fight with less strength, and as weeks dragged on, desperation showed in their gaunt faces and reckless charges. Courage without sustenance withered. Firepower without food was still firepower, but bayonets without rice were little more than sticks. At Henderson Field, Marines and Army troops fought side by side to defend the airstrip that had become the crown jewel of the campaign. Each attack repelled with Garand fire deepened the psychological divide. Japanese soldiers no longer believed their rifle and spirit were enough. Americans began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win. And belief in war is as lethal as any bullet. Yet the breaking of the myth did not mean safety. The Japanese were wounded, but not defeated. They adapted, probing the perimeter with smaller raids, snipers hidden in trees, artillery shells whistling into muddy trenches. The Marines, though emboldened, were still stretched thin, still shivering in the rain, still counting every ration. They knew another assault could come at any time, and that even the Garand could not hold forever without men behind it strong enough to keep pulling the trigger. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the Marines, wrote after Bloody Ridge, "The Garand gave us an edge we scarcely deserved. Without it, the outcome might have been different." His words underline the fragile balance of the campaign. It was not inevitable that America would hold Guadalcanal. It was a razor's edge, sharpened by the steel of a rifle mocked at first, then feared. The rain continued to fall, drowning the ridge in mud and silence. The battlefield lay thick with bodies, some half buried in waterlogged soil, others twisted among the root. Marines picked through the carnage, reloading clips, wiping mud from their rifle stocks. They were tired, but their grip on Guadalcanal was firmer than before. The myth of Japanese invincibility had shattered, replaced by a new reality. The Americans, with their Garands, could stand toe-to-toe with the Empire and hold their ground. Still, victory came at a cost. For every Marine who laughed in relief, another stared blankly into the jungle, haunted by the faces that charged and fell. They had broken the myth, yes, but in doing so, they had glimpsed the depths of sacrifice required to win. And though the ridge was secure, the campaign was far from over. The Japanese were regrouping, planning, waiting for another night to test the Americans again. The jungle was not finished teaching its lessons, and the echo of gunfire would return. By February of 1943, the jungle of Guadalcanal was silent in a way it had never been before. The constant crack of rifles and whine of artillery had faded into the background hum of cicadas and the soft rush of rain. The Japanese had withdrawn. Months of brutal fighting had bled them dry, leaving the island to the weary Marines and Army troops who had clung to it with desperation. Guadalcanal, the place many had thought America could not hold, was now secure. And in foxholes littered with empty clips and rusted helmets, one truth lingered: the M1 Garand had proven itself beyond dispute. The men who carried it bore scars that statistics cannot capture. They had endured hunger so sharp their ribs pressed against skin, malaria that rattled bones with fever, nights when every shadow seemed alive. Through it all, their rifles had answered. Private First Class Richard Tregiscus, who survived the campaign, remembered that the Garand was steady, always steady. In the dark, when you thought you might break, it was there in your hands. The relationship between soldier and rifle had become intimate, even sacred. Many Marines swore they trusted it more than the officers above them, because the Garand never failed when the world collapsed. The Japanese retreat was not simply a military maneuver. It was an admission that courage alone could not overcome logistics, air power, and above all, firepower. Diaries recovered from abandoned packs tell of men starving on a handful of rice a day, still believing in the Emperor's cause, but unable to face the ceaseless wall of American bullets. One soldier wrote, "Their rifles fire like the rain, without pause. We run, we fall, we do not reach them." Such lines, stripped of propaganda, reveal the collapse of faith. The Arasaka, once a symbol of discipline, had been outpaced by the Garand's relentless rhythm. For the Americans, the campaign reshaped how they saw themselves. Before Guadalcanal, many feared the Japanese were unbeatable. Afterward, they knew that with the right tools and stubborn resolve, they could win. The Garand was not the only factor. Air support, naval reinforcements, and raw endurance all mattered. But the rifle became a symbol of this transformation. It gave every soldier the sense that he could fight back, not as part of a slow and plodding firing line, but as an individual capable of pouring rapid, deadly fire into the heart of an assault. That feeling mattered as much as strategy. General George S. Patton, never one to mince words, called the Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. Dwight Eisenhower echoed the sentiment, recognizing that the rifle gave American infantry a decisive edge. These were not hollow boasts. They were observations grounded in the mud of Guadalcanal, in the shattered banzai charges that never reached their mark, in the exhausted Marines who lived to fight another day because their rifles had given them seconds they otherwise would not have had. The Garand had turned the American infantryman into something new, a soldier who could meet massed assaults not with scattered fire, but with a storm of lead. Even decades later, veterans remembered the sound. That distinctive ping, the slap of the clip flying free, became a part of their memory as much as the faces of comrades. In reunions long after the war, gray-haired men would mimic the sound, their eyes crinkling with bittersweet pride. It was more than nostalgia. It was recognition that their lives had been bound to that rifle, that in the darkest nights, its voice had spoken louder than fear. To laugh at the Garand had once been easy. To fear it became unavoidable. The irony was sharp. What the Japanese mocked as weakness became the instrument of their defeat. Their belief in the superiority of spirit over steel collided with modern reality. The Garand embodied that reality, a weapon of industrial America, mass-produced yet intimate, mechanical yet personal. It was not elegant, not refined in the old sense of craftsmanship, but it was efficient, dependable, and merciless. In the Pacific, efficiency proved deadlier than tradition. But even as Guadalcanal ended, the war pressed on. New campaigns waited: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Each would demand more blood, more endurance, more echoes of the Garand's bark across beaches and ridges. For the Marines and soldiers who shouldered it, the rifle remained both burden and blessing. It was heavy on long marches, awkward in swollen hands, yet it was also the constant ally that turned impossible defenses into victories. The men carried scars, but they carried confidence too, and confidence in war can mean survival. There were moments, however, when the rifle could not shield them. The jungle still took its toll. Disease still thinned the ranks. Comrades still fell beside them. The Garand could not erase grief. And yet, in the midst of loss, it gave them a measure of power, a belief that they were not entirely helpless. That mattered in a war where helplessness could break a man before a bullet ever touched him. For some, the rifle became the line between despair and endurance. When the Japanese finally evacuated Guadalcanal, slipping away under the cover of night, the Marines watched the quiet beaches with a mix of relief and exhaustion. The victory was theirs, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. They had broken the myth of invincibility, not through sheer numbers or unyielding courage alone, but with a rifle that allowed them to meet each charge with unrelenting fire. In that sense, the Garand was not simply a weapon, it was proof that the tide of war could turn. The story of Guadalcanal is not just a chronicle of battles. It is the story of belief shattered and rebuilt, of soldiers discovering that modern war demanded more than valor. It demanded tools equal to the task. The Garand gave them that, and in doing so, it reshaped the psychology of the war. From the mud of a forgotten island, it carried its reputation across oceans, destined to echo in Europe as well, where American soldiers would march with the same rifles into France and beyond. Today, when historians call the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised, they do not speak only of its mechanics, its gas-operated action, its 8-round clip, its .30-06 bite. They speak of the men who clung to it in foxholes, who trusted it when all else failed, who survived because it gave them time and power. They speak of Guadalcanal, where laughter turned to dread, and dread to retreat. Yet even as the jungle grew quiet in 1943, the war's fury had only begun to unfold. The Garand had proven itself, but it would soon be tested on shores far from the Pacific. The echo of its fire would cross continents, shaping not just battles but the very course of the century. And in that unfinished silence, the world held its breath, waiting for the next clash where steel, spirit, and survival would collide once more.